So first of all, welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming out on this non-rainy night. It's so great to see people in person again after a couple of years of having to do this by Zoom. It really is a pleasure to be in a room with so many friends and neighbors again. My name is Don Davies. I'm the Member of Parliament for Vancouver, Kingsway. And at the very outset, I want to acknowledge that we gather on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people, by whose grace we are allowed to live, work, and play. I'm delighted to co-host this exciting town hall with my wonderful colleague from Vancouver East, Jenny Kwan, Member of Parliament, who's on the stage. We are technically in Van East, I think, right here, aren't we, Jenny? Yeah, but by one block. 16th is the barrier, so this was the result of great negotiations, but this is where we settled. I'm especially thrilled to have with us tonight one of Canada's brightest and most progressive economic minds, Jim Stanford. Before I go into the format for this evening and introduce our special guest, I'd like to say a few words about why we organized this event. It's very clear that there are many important issues in politics, hundreds, if not thousands, maybe. But some are foundational. Some affect people in a way, and to a depth, and to a degree that others don't. And I think the economy is such an issue. The availability of work, what is happening to wages, purchasing power, interest rates, and tax policy, the role that governments play, the Bank of Canada's approach, all have a profound impact on all of us in a very fundamental way. The very ability of us to afford life hangs in the balance on these issues. To put it really bluntly, as the Democratic strategist James Carville said, it's the economy, stupid. But often we on the left are crowded out in this discussion. We are drowned out by business leaders and corporate media and right-wing academics who generally convey a very one-sided view of the world, our economy, and our society. And I think it's a fair comment to say that economics is more of an art than a science. There are, in truth, many differing opinions, often depending much on whose interests are really being considered. And with corporatist parties governing Canada since Confederation, that usually is not working people and marginalized groups. So back in August, when we were thinking of holding a town hall, we could see that we were entering a particularly turbulent time that satisfies both of these observations. First, with a rapid rise in inflation and interest rates, millions of Canadians were about to be impacted in a very dramatic and potentially very harmful way. And second, we knew we were about to be bombarded with right-wing corporatist views that would identify the causes of the economic situation very differently than we would and prescribe very different solutions to deal with it. So we decided to organize a town hall that would invite members of our community to share their experiences and views on the economy and hear from a leading progressive economic thinker to offer an alternative examination of our economy and options to address it. Because the left does have sophisticated and thoughtful views on the economy, policies that I think are actually better, more equitable, and more effective than the ones we usually hear when we turn on the television. So tonight, we're going to do that. Now the format is I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague Jenny Kwan for her opening remarks. Then I will introduce our speaker, Jim Stanford. He will speak for about 30 minutes, and he has a slideshow. We will use the remaining time, about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how long it goes, to hear from you, to hear your comments, your questions, and hopefully your experiences and ideas. In order to facilitate as many voices as possible, we will limit the speakers in the first round to 2 minutes. That will be ruthlessly enforced by volunteers who have been carefully selected for their dedication to time management We will also condition you all with a Pavlovian bell that will go off at 2 minutes, at which time you will stop or salivate. We'll also strive for a balance in gender identities in hearing from folks tonight. And then at the end, Jenny Kwan will provide a wrap-up. So I look forward to a stimulating and thoughtful discussion. And now I will turn the mic over to Jenny Kwan for her welcome and introductory remarks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dawn. That was excellent. Yes, my name is Jenny Kwan. I'm the Member of Parliament for Vancouver East. Welcome to Vancouver East, even though if it's just by one block. And I am also very grateful and want to acknowledge the First Peoples, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples for allowing us to gather in their unceded Coast Salish territories. A big thank you to all of you for taking time out, your very busy schedule, to join with us today. When we organize these events, we're always worried, are people going to come? Is this interesting to people? Is this only just interesting to us? And of course, you've demonstrated that is absolutely an important and interesting issue for us to engage in. As Dawn had indicated, I think this is a critical question that we need to grapple with. In the House of Commons, we're seeing this debate that go on all the time. We have the newly elected Conservative leader with a very skewed view that he takes to the economy and the issue around inflation. And his one solution, of course, is stop taxing people and get rid of government, right? We've heard it over and over again, and here we are. The history repeats itself. Things don't change all that much. And then on the other side, we have the Liberal government, who seems to me is in perpetual chaos. And I say it not to be partisan, but it just seems to me that they haven't quite figured it out in terms of the direction that we need to take. And so here we are. Coming out of COVID, we know that things have shifted very significantly. The economy has shifted as well. People's lives have shifted. Industry has shifted. In the midst of all of that, we have several crises that are going on in our community, whether it be the drug poisoning crisis that's going on, the housing crisis going on, the environmental climate crisis that's going on. These things are all kind of coming to a head. And I think it's so critical for us to think about what is our future. What does that economy look like, right? What do we need to do? How do we plan, and how do we move it forward? And so I'm so very grateful to have the leading voice on the progressive spectrum to join us today to share his view with us, his expertise, and to engage in a conversation with all of you so that we can bring back this message to the House of Commons and continue to fight for what I believe a progressive agenda in the economy that leaves no one behind. So with that, I am going to hand the floor back over to Dawn, who will introduce our very special guest, and then we'll take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Stanford, who is an economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. Jim is one of Canada's best-known economists. He served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union, formerly the Canadian Auto Workers. Jim is quoted frequently in the media and contributes regular commentaries to the Toronto Star, Global National News, and the CBC. He is also the Harold Innis Industry Professor in Economics at McMaster University in Hamilton, and an honorary professor in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney, not the one on Vancouver Island, the one down under. Jim received his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York. He also holds a master's in economics from Cambridge University and a Bachelor of Arts honors in economics from the University of Calgary. Gee, how did you get to be progressive going to come to the University of Calgary? Anyway, Jim is the author of Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism, which has been published in 6 languages. He has written, edited, or co-edited 6 other books and dozens of articles and reports in both peer-reviewed and popular outlets. Jim has provided research and advice through numerous federal and provincial government panels and inquiries on economic policy, innovation, jobs, and social policy. Jim is especially recognized for his ability to communicate economic concepts in an accessible and humorous manner. No pressure on you tonight, Jim. He divides his time between Vancouver, BC and Sydney, Australia. We are delighted to have Jim Stanford with us tonight. Please give him a warm East Vancouver welcome.
Thank you very much, Don and Jenny. Gosh, what a pleasure to come and meet with you all in person. Oh my God, you're so much better looking than you are on Zoom. That's all I can say. And you're much bigger than you are in those little boxes. So this is just wonderful to be able to meet, because, you know, our movement builds power from getting together, doesn't it? That's the whole idea of socialism, getting together. And I know we try hard on social media and Zoom and everything else, but there's nothing like actual live, breathing human beings, eye to understand we're in something together and we're going to build it together. So thank you very much. Also, Don and Jenny, each alone, among my favorite politicians ever. So activist, so accountable, so rooted in your communities, but not just representing your communities, representing a progressive vision in so many ways. And I see you all the time raising these issues in the House of Commons and nationally. And together, you're like a dynamic duo or something like that. It's like the sum is more than the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And thank you very much for having me. Thank all of you for coming up to hear an economist, they say, you know. It's sort of like the Grim Reaper coming, as I'll mention later, like the title of a Stephen King novel or something like that, you know. It was a cold Monday evening in Vancouver, and along came the economist. But, and making matters worse, you know who we're up against tonight, right? You know who we're up against? Lizzo. Lizzo, the great singer, is down at the arena. She shows up every time at her concerts with a flute. She's sometimes got these very famous historic flutes. I have no flute, but I do have a kazoo. Okay, I don't know if that would count. That was Solidarity Forever, by the way, in case which is a good song to sing today, considering the ass kicking that Doug Ford took in Ontario.
No kidding.
I was thinking if Doug Ford gets away with this, then every right-wing asshole politician is going to try it as soon as it's convenient. Throw your Charter of Rights in the garbage because it's inconvenient. And thank goodness for the unity. And I know it's not over yet. We've still got some fights ahead on that battle, but I feel good about that, really good about that. Okay, so I am just going to run through this presentation about...
There are some seats at the front. For anybody in the back who wants to sit down, there's about 8 seats in the front, just if you want.
Excellent. Okay, Center for Future Work. This is our little progressive economics think tank. We have an office here and an office in Australia. All of our research is open access on the website there. And there's my handle and our center's handle on Elon Musk's favorite social media platform, which I guess we've got to find a new way to communicate. That may be what the lesson is. I don't know. Twitter's a very important channel, of course, especially in policy debates. But we can't have him running the show. In fact, I heard today, I don't know if you heard this, he's facilitating, now that he's taken over Twitter, he's facilitating a 3-way merger between Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Can you imagine what the concentrated power of that would be? And apparently he wants to call it U-Twitface. U-Twitface would be the name of the platform, so we got to stop his battle for U-Twitface. Ryan, is there an easy way to get so I can see the slides as I'm doing it? If it isn't, no, okay, that's fine.
You're a bad boy.
That's why they're not letting me see what I'm going to do. Okay. Well, economics, a dismal science, what can I say? And it's more dismal than usual these days, because of course we've had the pandemic. I can't blame economics for that. But then afterwards, we've had the takeoff in inflation as the economy's reopened. Now we've got super high interest rates, which is the conventional recipe for fighting inflation, which in many ways is a cure worse than the disease. And now we've got the prospect of a recession coming down the pike. Most economists, myself included, think that's probably what's next. So the usual dismal view of economics is all the darker these days, and that makes it all the more important, as Don and Jenny were saying, that the progressive movement has its own narrative about what's happened, why it's happened, who's benefited and who's paid, and of course what the alternatives are. And we'll keep trying hard to change the minds of the decision makers, like the head of the Bank of Canada and the Prime Minister. And of course, the NDP caucus has done an extraordinary job extracting very important incremental progress from that federal government. But they still have a mindset and they still have a storyline, and they're sticking to it. We'll try to change their minds. We'll try to change others, even if we don't succeed. As an economist, I think it's vital that we all understand what's going on, that we have a bit of economic literacy to be able to call bullshit on the storyline that we get from the Pierre Poilievres and the CEOs and others who will say that what's happening is somehow our fault. I used a technical term there, bullshit, by the way. I should, in the interest of popular education, define the terms as I go along. Bullshit means hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay, so just keep the literacy going. But even if we don't change their minds, we've got to have a storyline. Pierre Poilievre has a storyline. It's utter lies. It's misinformation. It's dangerous. But he's got a storyline, and it's out there. And if I'm right, and we are headed into a recession, that hundreds of thousands of Canadians could lose their jobs in, and millions of Canadians will suffer in. That is an incredible breeding ground for Poilievre's version of the truth and the hate that comes with it. And this is why it's so important that you came tonight to hear a different perspective on why the economy is in trouble and what we can do about it. This is, of course, the thing that's captured everyone's attention over the last 18 months, which is the takeoff in inflation in Canada. For about 30 years, it seemed like, it wasn't an issue anymore. It was trucking along at around 2%, a little higher sometimes, more often a little lower. The Bank of Canada had a goal of keeping inflation at 2%. In general, it missed the goal from below more often than from above. We had the pandemic in 2020. The dark blue line is the total rate of inflation, the overall consumer price index. The light blue line is the measure excluding some of the most volatile issues like the food and energy prices. But both of them dipped significantly during the worst initial days of the pandemic. And then as the economy has reopened since the pandemic, taken off. So the overall rate peaked at a little above 8% in June. It's come down. It's now down to 6.9%. This is mostly because of gasoline prices. Gasoline prices went up. Gasoline prices have come down a bit. Gasoline prices have gone back up. I don't know if you've noticed. So this number is probably going to go up again next month. It's got nothing to do with the Bank of Canada, okay? Nothing to do with the success of their inflation crusade. I can assure you, OPEC doesn't care what the interest rate is in Canada when they set the world price of oil, okay? And neither does Imperial Oil and Shell and all the other companies that are making unbelievable money from this current situation. So it's gone up, it's come back down, but it's still high, and this is still a problem. And of course, for Canadians who have to pay the bills, we feel it. So unless your wages were going up at 6.9% in the last 12 months, and there aren't many other than CEOs who've got a wage increase of that magnitude, what it means is our real purchasing power has shrunk. And then for people on low incomes or fixed incomes or income supports, the battle is all the more desperate. What's caused this and what is the outlook for it? Well, some of it is transitory. Transitory has a bad name these days because central banks around the world had said this would be a transitory or temporary phenomenon, and it's turned out to be more stubborn than they expected. But many of the factors are still transitory, related to the pandemic, the lockdowns, the disruptions in supply chains. Think about things like semiconductors or motor vehicles or building products that were very hard to find during the lockdowns. The prices of those products went up. International transportation linkages were disrupted because of limits on transportation, international travel, shipping, etc. You also had Canadians and others around the world who for several months couldn't do what we normally did. That included going out shopping, that included going out eating, that included travel, many other things. So you had a situation where consumers put off different purchases, and then once things opened up and you were able to get back to something like normal, we aren't there yet, of course, then there was a surge of consumer spending that pushed up prices, and also a bit of a redistribution of what we spent on. So during the lockdowns, you couldn't travel, you couldn't eat out, so we bought home electronics to watch Netflix on, and we bought building supplies to renovate our basements with. So those were some of the things that led the initial surge in inflation. The energy price thing was a huge part of it, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes. Some of these temporary sort of readjustment problems are fixing themselves. They absolutely are. So some of these international supply chains are back to normal. There are no ships waiting anymore at the Los Angeles port, which was a giant problem a year ago. There were other price increases for different minerals, many international agricultural commodities, shipping costs. The prices are all coming down, and eventually that will show up in lower consumer prices, no doubt about it. On the other hand, in the meantime, these inflationary pressures have spread into other areas of the economy, and this is what gives the Bank of Canada nightmares at night. They predict, thanks to their tough love medicine, that they'll get inflation back to 3% by the end of next year and 2% by the end of 2024. Their target is to keep it at 2%, but they give themselves 1 percentage point in either direction as a buffer. And they think if they move fast and hard enough, they'll get it down to within that target by roughly a year from now. Who knows if that will work or not. In general, it takes longer for inflation to come down than it does for it to go up. That's the painful reality. So I think that view is a bit optimistic. Just a little bit more on, again, some of the aspects related to the causes of inflation after the pandemic. We hear the story from the Bank of Canada that the economy is overheating, that the labor market is overheating, that we have too much demand, that there's too much going on. We're kind of overstretching the limits of the economy. And this is quite wrong. In fact, we aren't even back to where we should be if there hadn't been a pandemic. And this graph shows where our GDP, the dark blue line, lots of problems with GDP. It's not a measure of social progress or anything like that, but it is a measure of how much we produce in our economy for money, trickling along at a steady pace there until the pandemic, fell off a cliff. That's the fastest, steepest decline in GDP we've ever experienced, far worse than it was in the Great Depression of the 30s, for example. Bounced back a little bit, fast enough to give people whiplash. The reason it bounced back so fast was the extraordinary things that governments did in the meantime. The CERB payments, all of the other income supports, wage subsidies. The Bank of Canada at this point was doing everything they could to prevent a depression, including alternative ways of getting credit flowing in the economy through the banking system. So we had an amazingly fast rebound, more immediate than I certainly would have expected of most economists. We didn't get back to where we needed to be, though, and we're still just kind of tricking along. So we're actually still working well below our capacity as an economy. We aren't producing the full range of goods and services that we could and should be based on our population, our capital stock, our technology, immigration, and so on. So, and in fact, we're now getting further away from that goal of producing everything that we could. In fact, since the Bank of Canada began increasing interest rates in March, the gap between the actual line and the pre-COVID trend line has gotten a little bit wider. And if the problem is that we've got supply disruptions causing inflation, and that is a big part of the story here, what could be worse than shrinking supply? But that's what we're doing right now. We're actually making the supply problem worse because of this very contractionary medicine. Another completely historically unique aspect to this was the fact that during the worst times of the pandemic, when the real GDP fell, that blue line is just another version of the line we just saw, the big decline during the lockdowns, the aggregate incomes of Canadians actually rose. And this is kind of a very curious result, and it was purely because of the CERB and all of the other income supports that were paid out. And that meant that across all Canadian households, this isn't true for everyone, of course, including a lot of people who live in this part of the world, their incomes did not go up. But in aggregate, disposable income in Canada went up because the CERB and the other benefits more than offset the decline in employment income that you would have expected given that decline in output. Now, people say, does that mean the government overdid it? I don't think so, because the main reason that happened is the employment didn't fall as deeply and as long as had been expected, given how bad the lockdowns were, because of the money that was pumped into the economy to keep spending going. So this wasn't a mistake, but it is a unique situation that people had more money but less opportunity to spend it. And that, again, contributed to the pent-up savings that we have and this phenomenon of money, lots of money chasing not enough goods. Now, you often hear that that's what causes inflation. What causes inflation? Oh, too much money chasing too few goods. But you don't know whether the problem's too much money or too few goods. You know, and in retrospect, the problem was a bit of both, frankly. We don't have enough supply yet. That is still part of the problem. And we have some built-up savings from the income supports that were essential to getting us through. I mentioned some of the deflationary impacts globally that are happening. I know this is, given the screen and so on, hard for folks to see, but a number of them are just coming down very, very, very dramatically. From peak to closing, lumber prices. You know, lumber prices absolutely went bananas during the first bit of the pandemic, down 75%. International shipping costs down 65%. Iron ore down 45%. Lots of these other things that initially drove the problem are retreating. I do want to have just an additional word about the energy piece of it, because the rise in gasoline prices has been the biggest single contributor to inflation in Canada. And you know, unless you got an electric car, and I can't wait to get mine, unless you've got one, you know full well what I'm talking about in terms of $2 a liter prices. And we're told that this is all Vladimir Putin's fault because he invaded Ukraine. Now, obviously, that invasion was horrible and has caused all kinds of havoc. But it's hard to say that it was actually the result of disruptions in world oil supply resulting from that war. That war was horrible, needs to stop. But it didn't affect world oil supply at all. In fact, world oil supply has increased since the war, including the supply that comes from Russia. They're pumping more oil, not less. And they're getting a hell of a lot more money for it, by the way, which means, you know, the way we've organized the world oil market, and Canada has tied itself to the world oil market, rightly or wrongly, has rewarded Putin for what's happened, because their revenues in Russia have increased, not decreased, despite the sanctions. So what does this mean for us? How do we then say this is the biggest single cause of the inflation that is turning our whole economy upside down and might lead to a recession? It's got nothing to do with a shortage of oil, absolutely nothing. I mean, first of all, we have to get off oil anyway, and if we'd gotten off oil when we should have and done it faster, we'd be much less vulnerable to this fossil fuel inflation than we are. But at any rate, the stuff that we buy in the gas pump is made from Canadian oil, not from Ukrainian oil. Ukraine doesn't produce oil. It's not made from Russian oil. It's made here. It's dug out, refined, distributed, and sold here. So how do we then say, well, it's just a matter of supply and demand. That's why we're paying $2 a liter at the gas pump. And I think we need to interrogate that assumption that the energy market is somehow natural and efficient and supply and demand forces, when in fact it's absolute greed and power. Greed and power of a small number of huge corporations, largely foreign-owned, pumping out our oil and selling it to us at an extravagant price, absolutely extravagant price. And just recognizing that doesn't solve the problem. It's complicated how we would fix that. I think we know how we could start to fix it. And Don and Jenny and the caucus have been proposing ideas in that direction. But at least understanding what's going on, and this isn't about supply and demand and rational market forces. It's about something else. We have in Canada said the price of our energy, even energy produced and consumed here, is going to be set in this global casino called the World Oil Futures Market. It isn't about, you know, supply and demand. It's about investors around the world who place bets. It's just like the stock market or the foreign exchange market or a derivatives market. It's a financialized casino, and people place bets there to try and guess whether the oil price is going to go up or down. And what that means is when it goes down too far. In the first months of the pandemic, the oil price was negative, which makes no sense whatsoever. Then when it comes up too far. And we get the roller coaster as a result. And a group of Canadians and foreign investors in Canadian companies are making out like bandits from the pain that we pay every time we're at the pump. Now that's a bit of background on the problem of inflation and where it came from. Now we're encountering the orthodox response to the problem, which will end up doing more harm than good, frankly. You have a situation where central banks around the world, including ours in Canada, the Bank of Canada, which is owned by the federal government, it sets interest rates, oversees the financial system, and operates as a bank to the government. Central banks everywhere have launched this crusade to stop inflation. 50 different countries have increased interest rates all at the same time. And that's going to create a magnified impact. If it was 1 or 2 or 3 countries, that would be something. When it's 50 countries all at the same time, it's going to be a tidal wave of higher interest rates and dramatic changes in financial markets. That is going to reduce inflation. There's no doubt about that. In fact, even if Canada did nothing, the global impact of that tightening would have big impacts on the world economy and on us. But for some strange reason, Canada's near the front of the pack in this race to tighten up money supply, increase interest rates, and slow down inflation. So this shows the size of the interest rate increases that have happened in different major industrial countries so far this year. And Canada's in second place, just a hair behind the Americans. The Americans have been a little bit more aggressive. We've been almost as aggressive. Other countries have increased interest rates too, but not as aggressively as Canada, and it's not clear to me why we have to be at the lead of this parade. We're a small, open trading economy. We can't control what goes on in the world. The US Fed can, frankly, but we can't. So why do we think we have to be, the role model for this crusade against inflation? I'm usually great at cheering for Canada. I cheer for the hockey team. I cheer for the women's soccer team. The men's soccer team usually disappoint, but the women always do great. And maybe this year the men will do well, actually. That's possible. Right, yeah, that's it. There's a Davies on the team. Alfonso, your long-lost cousin, maybe. Okay. But this is a race I'm not cheering for Canada. This is a dubious distinction. And notice many of the countries, the Europeans, for example, have been much more easygoing on it. They're concerned about inflation too. Their inflation is worse than ours, actually. But they aren't, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Japan hasn't increased interest rates at all. And they've got 3% inflation in Japan. So interesting to ask, why do we have to be at the lead of this crusade? What is going to happen? It's a very painful and slow process to use this sledgehammer called higher interest rates to try and solve the problem of inflation. It can work. It does work. It probably will work. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to be very, very painful. The problem is, if you've got one thing in your toolkit, if only you've got is a hammer in your toolkit, everything looks like a nail, right? If all you've got in the toolkit as the central bank is the sledgehammer, then whatever's happening, you pull out that sledgehammer and start whacking it around. And that's what we're experiencing. Some things actually get more expensive because of the higher interest rates. So housing costs are a good example. Housing prices are falling. The resale market, the property market, etc., has definitely been pricked. That big balloon is letting out air quick, and we've seen that in really rapid declines in the number of sales and also a bit in the price. But you have to offset that against the higher interest charges that you pay on a mortgage. That shows up in the consumer price index, and you have to offset that against rents, because fewer people can buy a house, more people are renting, and rental prices are skyrocketing. Here in BC, the NDP government put a 2% limit on the amount of rent increase. That was incredibly important, and more places should do that, although there are lots of loopholes in that rent control, as you know. But housing prices in general have gone up, not down. The higher interest rates in Canada do not affect all of those global factors that I mentioned, including the price of energy. They also make life more difficult for governments, frankly. Right now, one of the things that government has been able to do is spend a lot of money to help us through that recession with the pandemic, and it was dead cheap to do so because interest rates were so low. As interest rates go up, then it becomes harder and harder for governments to do that. They can, and they should, but it becomes more expensive. But that doesn't matter. None of that matters. The Bank of Canada says we're going to get inflation down to 2% no matter what. That is exactly what they say, no matter what. That is the monetary policy equivalent of the American general who said we will destroy this village in order to save it. Okay? When they say we'll get inflation to 2% no matter what, they mean, even if that means a recession. And they know it probably does mean a recession. So it shows that they have distorted emphasis that they put on inflation at the expense of every other goal. Inflation is a problem, yes, but we have a lot of other problems at the same time. And we can't just become myopically focused on one particular number and say that's the only one that matters. We are going to see over the next year to two some very difficult financial and economic conditions. That's the sad reality. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but again, I think we have to be ready for it and we have to understand why it's happening. Higher interest rates take 12 to 18 months to have their impact on real investment, real spending decisions, real economic activity. So we are not in a recession yet. In fact, we saw it last week. We had a very positive jobs number that Statistics Canada released for October. I was surprised by it, 100,000 jobs created. So clearly we're still not in recession. And the irony in this environment is that was a bad news thing. 100,000 more Canadians working, yet the Bank of Canada says too many Canadians are working. That is what they say. That is actually what they say. When they say the labor market is overheated, too many of you have work and you have too much money. So that's why we have inflation. They say, can you imagine? Go to the parking lot at Save-On Foods and ask people, after they've just paid $200 friggin' for a cart of groceries, and they're going to their car and say, do you think the reason your groceries are so expensive is because too many of you are working and you have too much money, right? You'd be lucky to escape with your life, to escape that parking lot with your life. But that is exactly what Tiff Macklem and the Bank of Canada is saying. So 100,000 jobs is a bad news story. It means it isn't really a bad news story, don't get me wrong, it's a great news story. And I try to remind people that that's what it's all about. Work, production, generate income, produce the goods and services we need, pay taxes. That's the source of prosperity. So this was good news. But in this environment, in our upside down world of orthodox monetary policy, it becomes bad news. We are going to see that slow down and probably change negative over the next year. We're already seeing faster results and negative results in financial markets, housing prices, as I mentioned, cryptocurrency. I hope nobody out there bought it. It was a scam, but it's collapsing, sovereign debt, etc. We've never had a situation where we tried to get the inflation rate down 5 percentage points from 7 to 2. Okay, that's why I got a PhD in economics, so I can do that sort of thing. Right in my head, Don, right in my head. 7 to 2, 5-point decline. Didn't even have a calculator, nothing. We have never done that without a recession. So why on earth are we going to do it without a recession this time? Dream on. Of course, we have our cautionary tale, which was the short-lived... Was she the shortest-lived Prime Minister in Britain ever? She did set the record, right? I know the lettuce outlasted Truss. So, anyways, she came and went and created a lot of chaos in her wake, including a near collapse of the pension funding system in Britain because of her budget, which had all these enormous tax cuts for rich people. Classic shock doctrine, and Naomi Klein's great book, Shock Doctrine, here's a case study in it. There's a pandemic, there's inflation, quick, cut taxes for rich people. It's what we wanted to do all along, right? And this is the moment to do it. That's what she tried, but it didn't work in part because interest rates shot up as part of this monetary tightening, and suddenly pension funds were on the verge of collapse. And this shows you how fragile many of those financial institutions are out there. And we are going to see collapses. We don't know exactly when and where. If I knew when and where, I could short the stocks, make $1 billion, and donate it to the NDP, okay? But I don't know exactly when and where, but I can assure you that it's going to happen. And that experience in Britain was just one of the early signs. Think back to 2007, the year before the GFC hit. There were things like that happening every couple of months. A bank nearly collapsed or something went broke or something else. That's the stage we're at right now. And because of this sudden increase in interest rates around the world, that's caused enormous rapid changes in different asset prices for different types of bonds and derivatives. And that's going to leave different financiers exposed to the raw reality that they don't have money to pay their bills. It's very different than the old bank collapse that we're used to hearing about. Does anyone remember Mary Poppins, the movie, one of my favorites, with my kids? When Jane and Michael Banks go to the bank and Michael has tuppence and his dad says you must invest it in the bank, and the CEO talks about all the amazing things that the tuppence will do. You'll be part of railways through Africa, dams across the Nile, fleets of ocean greyhounds, plantations of ripening tea, all from your tuppence. And he says, no way, I want to feed the birds. Some of the customers overhear that he has a tussle with the owner over the tuppence, and then there's a run on the bank. All the consumers run to the teller, try to pull their money, and the bank collapses, right? That's the Mary Poppins Bank collapse, and that is how it happened in the 1890s. That isn't how it happens anymore. How it happens today, you get dramatic shocks in asset prices. All of these leveraged financiers who've been using borrowed money to place bets in that financial casino suddenly realize they're uncovered, they can't cover their losses, they get called to pay back, and they collapse. And it's bad for them, it's even worse for whoever they borrowed the money from. And what happens when a bank collapses today is other banks won't lend it money because they were too exposed. That's how it happened in the GFC, and that's how it's going to happen again. It's very, very fragile. Now, the Bank of Canada acknowledges in private the initial role of those global factors, the supply shocks and other things that I mentioned in starting inflation. They're now saying it doesn't matter. They're now saying to Canadian workers, I don't care whether you started it or not, you are going to pay to finish it. That is literally what the bank is saying. They're saying, even if wages didn't cause the inflation, we still have to suppress your wages in order to solve inflation. And this is why they've changed their narrative in the last months to talk about the overheated labor market, wages rising too high, workers having too much money. And it isn't true, but it's supporting their actions, and this is why they're doing it. So this claim about labor market overheating, we've heard a lot, and we're going to hear it a lot more. They stress, if you read through their monetary policy report, the last one, for example, do a count. You know how you can use a search and find in the document? You'll find 13 references to wage price spiral. Now do a count on the word profits. It doesn't show up. It's not even in the document. It's 36 pages long and it's not even in the document, which shows you they're only looking at one side of the street and forgetting the fact that, if we've got too much money chasing too few goods, well, the problem might be too few goods, not that we've got too much money. And this blindness, willful blindness to the distributional impacts of the inflation that has occurred and to the distributional impacts of their method of solving the inflation is anti-democratic, first of all. It's not good economics, and absolutely has to be resisted. We're still waiting for signs of this wage price spiral. Nominal wage growth in Canada, when it's correctly measured, is about 4% right now. It was 4% before the pandemic in 2019. There was no giant wage spiral back then. The unemployment rate back then was about 5 and a bit percent. It's about 5 and a bit percent today. This is not an overheated labor market. This is a relatively positive labor market. There's more work out there than has been the case in many other times in history, but it's absolutely not the source of the inflation problem. And when inflation is going at 7 or 8%, the real purchasing power of those wages is shrinking. That means workers are getting paid less, not more. In real terms, they're getting paid less. And if we were really in a labor shortage situation, normally you have to pay more for something that's in short supply. But we're seeing the exact opposite. So this graph shows the takeoff of CPI inflation at the beginning of the reopening in beginning of 2021 is when it went from under 2% to over 8% at peak. Average hourly wages were in fact falling initially, and I'll explain why in a minute, regained some momentum, around 5% a year over year right now, but that's a bit of a mirage because part of it is a compositional effect whereby the makeup of our labor market has changed, in part because people have left very low-paid jobs in retail and hospitality during the pandemic and gone out and found other jobs that pay better. So that doesn't mean wages are growing, it means they're finding better jobs, which is a different story. And again, something that's very positive, not something that's negative. Real wages, the real purchasing power of wages has been declining since the reopening. Now this shows the real purchasing power. That big spike you see on the left side is a bit of a mirage. What happened was when all of those low-wage retail and hospitality workers lost work during the lockdowns, the average wage for the people who were left was higher, not because they got a raise, but because all the low-wage people bore the brunt of the layoffs. That was one of the reasons why the layoffs alone were very unfair and why the CERB and all those other programs were so essential. So it looked like the real wage went up, but as soon as people came back to work, it came back down. So ignore the spike. But let's look at where we were at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, when the reopening happened, and look where we are now. We've lost about 5% real wages so far, and that's 5% of your living standards, at least the part of your living standards that you pay for with money. Of course, we also have our social programs and everything else that is part of our living standards. So the idea that workers are somehow, laughing all the way to the bank and causing this inflation is absolutely backwards. Bass-ackwards, actually, is the technical term in economics, bass-ackwards. It means fundamental direction of causation artificially reversed. Okay, that's I just made that up, Don. I just made that up right now. Bass-ackwards, technical definition. Okay. Backwards, labor's share of GDP has shrunk. Okay, since 2019, labor has lost about 2 percentage points of GDP in compensation and wages, salaries, and benefits. 2% doesn't sound like a lot. Our economy is $2.8 trillion. That's $56 billion. That's $3,000 per worker. Gone since 2019 because workers' share of GDP has declined. Where did it go? Hashtag duh, it went to businesses. So the energy companies, first and foremost, but also the housing developers, the supermarkets, the auto dealers have made a killing in this time. If anyone's tried to buy a new car in the last 2 or 3 years, you'll know why. Building supplies and forestry products, those are some of the industries where profits just exploded because companies took advantage of the uncertainty and the supply chain disruptions and the pent-up consumer demand and jacked up their prices, okay? Is that greed or is that profit-maximizing behavior? I would say, how do you tell the difference between the two? It sounds like the same thing. But we should at least be honest, whatever we call it, whether we call it greedflation or we call it something else, we should be honest. A major factor in the prices that we're paying has been the increase in profit margins for the corporate sector. And in fact, company profits have become larger as a share of GDP than they ever have in Canadian history. So this is a tough time in Canada. And for the corporate sector, they have never had it better. And if that isn't a statement on how our society's priorities are wrong, okay, we'll never find a better one. These companies are making more money than they've ever made. And we're being blamed for it. We've had a lot of debate about supermarkets, and kudos to your caucus and Jugmeat and the whole crew for making it an issue and sparking that investigation that the House of Commons is undertaking and showing that people are getting ripped off. It's not the only reason grocery prices are high, but it's certainly part of it. The companies and their apologists are saying, no, you don't understand economics. It's just like you said, Jenny, at the beginning. We are crowded out and told we're naive or we're idiots, and we can't explain what's going on in the economy. And this is a great example. They come to us. I've argued with this guy on TV from Dalhousie University, who's like one of those really pompous asshole economists who thinks he knows it all. And anyone else is just an idiot. Okay? My PhD is as good as his PhD, and he treats me like I'm an idiot because we have different views. And he says, no, it's just a simple profit margin on a growing, base of sales and all this nonsense. Bullshit. There's my technical term again. Whoops, sorry. This is the increase in profits and wages in the food retailing sector, more than doubled since 2019. In the food manufacturing sector, they're up 50%, so they're doing pretty well as well. It's not just Loblaws. Across the whole economy, companies' profits are up 30%. Labor compensation in nominal dollars across the whole economy up 13%. So all profits have grown twice as fast as wages. And in the food sector, of course, it's been much more dramatic. We need to have a more balanced approach. So the Bank of Canada, in theory, since 2021, has been given the instructions to pursue both stable inflation and maximum sustainable employment. That's actually their marching orders from the government. They're clearly not doing that right now. So they need to be more balanced and they need to be more nuanced at how they go after inflation instead of just taking out that big sledgehammer. Secondly, the government has a role to play in terms of fiscal policy. It isn't just the Bank of Canada's job to manage inflation. The government has to be there with its budgets, with its spending, with its taxes. It could take actions to address the true causes of the inflation that we've seen, such as the housing bubble. That isn't just because of, inflationary pressures. That's because of the speculative nature of the housing market that we've created and the power of private developers and the speculation on land. Same goes for energy, as I mentioned, investing in a faster rollout of renewable energy. And excess inflationary profits have to be redistributed. We can't just sit back and suffer and tighten our belts while we see the energy companies and the housing companies and the banks now. The banks' profits are way up because we're paying so much more interest. We have to be able to capture some of those profits, as the NDP caucus has argued, and then use it to protect others against the impacts of inflation. We can manage labor markets in a better way, rather than this assumption that we have to have a certain level of unemployment out there to constantly discipline workers and keep them afraid so that their wage demands are down. We can plan, we can negotiate collective agreements, we can lift minimum wages in ways that are stable and gradual over time, in good times and in bad. And that's what's going to allow us to get to a position of very, very high employment, low unemployment, but keep wages at a level that makes sense economically. Finally, we just need a little bit of patience, because many of those initial factors associated with the pandemic, which was an event we've never seen before, are going to gradually work their way through. Now, that's the argument we're putting to the central bank. It's not clear that they're listening, and given what's happening globally, there's no doubt that we're going to face dramatic, painful times in the next couple of years. We are going to see a recession, and ironically, even as the recession starts, the central banks, including Canada, will still have their foot on the brakes. Normally, if you see the economy going to recession, they should be cutting interest rates to try to stimulate more work and more investment. They're still going to be increasing interest rates. That's going to make it a painful, long recession, like happened in the early 80s and like happened in the early 90s. The implications of that for the economy, for labor markets and budgets are going to be severe. We're going to see some financial ruptures, as I mentioned. Frankly, the thing that keeps me up at night, the prospect of a recession is bad enough. But when I see dangerous right-wing, populist, anti-democratic movements on the rise everywhere, including in Canada, then I think, my gosh, this is where we could look at history repeating itself. If there's masses of people displaced in this recession and they start listening to Pierre Poilievre and the Pierre Poilievres in other countries around the world, then we could really be in trouble in terms of our democratic future. And this is why it's so important for us to be explaining to workers what's happening and fighting for things to protect workers as we go through it. And again, Don, I saw your tweet the other day about Poilievre, and he's supposedly all for freedom. What did he have to say about throwing the Charter of Rights in the garbage in Ontario? Absolutely nothing. That's the sort of challenge we have to make to these charlatans who pretend they're speaking for workers. Fascists have always said they speak for workers, and of course they don't. So we have to be able to argue that there's a way through this coming challenge that is fair and sustainable and sensible. We're already seeing signs of economic slowdown. Now, this employment number is out of date, because I said it's fallen 100,000 in 4 months, which it had, but then it just made up 100,000 last month. So ignore that first bullet. I am a left-wing economist, so naturally, I look for the dark side and the future of capitalism, okay? And I have successfully predicted 13 out of the last 2 recessions. So this is the kind of approach that I take, but I'm still sticking to this prediction. I'm still sticking to this one. We got lots of negative things happening, and even the Bank of Canada acknowledges a 50-50 chance of recession. Now we're also looking at the other shoe possibly dropping, which is the impact of fiscal austerity on top of monetary austerity. And we're going to see we're already seeing the calls for governments to cut back spending, even though we're going into recession. So the Bank of Canada has one foot on the brake as we go into a recession. The government is now being told to put the other foot on the brake to limit how much spending is out there, which of course also makes the recession all the worse. We're already seeing a very dramatic decrease in federal government program spending. Last year and this year, federal program spending fell dramatically because we wrapped up these COVID programs. This year it's actually falling in nominal dollars, and in real per capita dollars it's really falling. So we have to be pushing hard for government to not follow this typical right-wing, we must balance the budget at all costs, even if we're in a recession. And again, Don and Jenny and their colleagues have done a fabulous job pushing the Liberals to do more than the Liberals really want to do, that's clear, and we're going to need to have more of that as we come ahead into this time. Poilievre is still out there saying the whole problem was caused by government overspending. And again, this is false, and we need to have the counter narrative, which is we needed government to protect Canadians during the pandemic. There's going to be adjustments as we come out of the pandemic, and let's go through those adjustments, take care of people, have a gradual, patient response to inflation, and make sure we keep people at work, which is the source of our prosperity. The things that we need from government that, again, Don and Jenny and their colleagues are going to be arguing for, we need those income supports. They've now ratcheted EI right back to where it was before the pandemic. All of the special access rules are gone, and we're going to have a situation where most people who need EI can't access it. So that's going to be a big problem if we go into a recession. Increase spending on healthcare and other public services. The premiers are meeting in Vancouver today, actually, on this very issue. Support wages so that they can keep up with inflation. The provincial government here has just signed a whole set of deals with public sector workers that pretty much, I think, protects their wages against inflation. And this is a very, very positive role model for what other governments should be doing, rather than Doug Ford throwing the Charter of Rights in the garbage to try and suppress real wages. And then make these investments to address the root causes of the whole thing. For us as progressives, we should try to convince Tiff Macklem, try to convince Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, try to convince the other decision makers to do the right thing and use whatever leverage we can. But even if we can't do that, we have to have that narrative out there about what caused this problem and what the solutions are. And demand the government do its role, which is to protect human beings, not meet a certain numerical target, whether it's an inflation rate or a budget deficit. And then fight like hell, as the workers did in Ontario this week, to defend our members against all those false arguments. Let me wrap it up. I have tested your patience with all these charts and graphs and my little misadventure with the Galen Weston video. Thank you again, Ryan. The key takeaways: our standard of living depends on work and the value that's added through our work. And we are producing more from our work as Canadians than we ever have before. And those workers got us through the pandemic. They're still getting us through what came after. We're still in a pandemic, let's face it. Workers did not cause this inflation. We should not tolerate belt tightening and a permanent shift in income distribution from workers to corporations. That's what would happen if we followed Tiff Macklem's advice and said, in the interests of getting inflation back to 2%, I will only ask for a 2% wage increase, even though inflation is 7%. What does that actually accomplish? That means that graph that I showed you of the redistribution of income from workers to corporations will be a permanent situation. That's exactly what it will mean, and we shouldn't tolerate that. We shouldn't tolerate companies having the ability to remake society in their favor by taking advantage of an unprecedented crisis. So, thank you very much for what you're doing, and for coming tonight, and I look forward to our... Thank you.
Good idea. Thank you very much. I've read your basic book on economics, and I enjoyed it. I'm involved a lot with Downtown East Side. I'm on the Carnegie Community Center Association board, and we had a disaster there with housing, with homeless people. And I saw a chart a while ago of how much the governments in the 70s were building almost as much housing as the private sector, and I've written to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives to get a copy of that chart, so I've lost it. But it seems to me if governments start building a lot of housing, that creates employment, and it creates also competition for the regular building industry, which would be a really good thing. But my question is would it be possible, because given the experience of quantitative easing in the 80s, and the money that was put in place during COVID, like why can't the central bank as a government institution, so if by keeping interest rates low or at zero, couldn't the government lend itself enough money to do whatever we need to create social employment, to build housing, for social benefits, to create services for people in addiction? I think this is all possible, or am I being wildly radical?
Both. It is possible and wildly radical. Thank you. I will answer it when we get a couple more.
Hands up. one of the major costs for businesses and worker is paying rent, and but the narrative we hear is the business owner and mainstream media blaming the labor cost for rising inflation. Looking through the empirical evidence, right, you see a lot of young people in Toronto and Vancouver are leaving because the rent too high. Do you think we can tackle inflation without tackling the real estate industry?
Thank you.
I guess my question is about housing and homes and the casino right now that we have in terms of the housing market. And if we had the federal government or governments have a rule that you can own one house, your home, you can maybe own another house if you really need one for an investment. But this idea of people owning many, many houses and flipping them, etc., if that was stopped, what would the effect of that be generally in terms of inflation or the housing market?
Excellent.
Okay, why don't we take the woman at the back there?
Hi there. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, so I work in the food industry with a lot of small businesses who manufacture food. And I'm hearing from my clients, a lot of them saying that, you know, their supplies are going up three times, but they can't actually charge these companies, such as Loblaws, any more money to buy their product. But Loblaws is raising their prices, so they're just making profit off of that. And I'm just wondering, as a person who buys food also, what is the incentive for Loblaws or any of these big companies to lower the cost of food? Because they are essential, we can't not go to them after, you know, this period of time is over. How are we going to actually make that happen and make food affordable again?
Oh, great. Those were great questions. The first three were all about housing. So how about that? You think we lived in the most expensive housed city in the entire planet, maybe, or something like that? Wow. Anyways, but the three went together all very nicely. We absolutely have to tackle housing if we're going to tackle inflation. Housing costs are the biggest single item in the overall bundle. The Consumer Price Index looks at all the goods and services we buy. 30% of the bundle is housing, based on how much we spend on housing. So that makes sense. So to bring down inflation, we could absolutely tackle the high price of housing and all of the things that were mentioned. Speculation on private housing markets and turnover and flipping properties, and it's ultimately the land that is the thing that is being speculated on. The building itself increasingly is almost an add-on to the actual land. You know that from when you look at the price of lots, and then people just tear down the old house and build a new one. So stopping the speculation, stopping at least the tax incentives for multiple home holding. They get to write it all off as investment costs and deduct their interest charges and find other ways to avoid paying taxes on it. And dramatically ramp up the supply of what I call non-market housing. It comes in all kinds of shapes and forms. One of the things in the 70s was housing co-ops, which were a very important, rapidly growing source of supply, but they've done almost nothing on since then. Also public housing, social housing, community housing trusts are another way to take the land and the buildings out of the speculative marketplace. And the government absolutely could afford to do it. They don't need to have the quantitative easing and all those things. They could absolutely just afford it by using the government's borrowing power, even conventionally, to access lower cost credit, because the government has the cheapest interest rates of any borrower, much cheaper than those housing developers that build the houses now, and really, really ramp up affordable housing. So it would be a powerful stimulus in the recession that's coming. It would also be a powerful tool for building a more inclusive city, including for the young people, as the questioner mentioned. So yes, 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 and yes to those questions, and yes, we can do it. On the food issue, that's a really important point you raised. It's not just the consumers getting screwed by Loblaws, it's the suppliers, the companies that sell to Loblaws. Some of them, not all of them. I showed you the graph for the food manufacturers. They're actually making pretty good money as well, the big ones. You know, think of the big meat processing and dairy companies and so on. But certainly smaller firms. And this is a way that a company like Loblaws exercises its market power. There's a thing called monopoly power, where they are the only seller of something, especially an essential good. Then there's a thing called monopsony, which is when you're the only buyer of something. And you get to use the same power of your size, in this case, to drive down the price instead of driving up the price. So many of those suppliers can't get access. They depend on Loblaws and the other chains to get their products on the shelves, otherwise they don't have a market. And then Loblaws squeezes them. You know who else Loblaws squeezes? The workers. And we saw this big time. Remember in the pandemic, there was the $2 an hour hero pay that was paid for everyone who was brave enough to go to work. Remember, that was before vaccines and everything else. You could die. You could die because you went to work to let us buy groceries. They were heroes. And $2 an hour was the least that they deserved. Then, about 4 months later, Loblaws, Sobeys, and Metro, within one day, all took away the $2. So how can you say that all happened in one day? That was absolute collusion, and it was monopsony power is what it was. They were driving down the price of something they buy, the labor. So the concentrated power of supermarkets, frankly, they are not the worst example in the economy. The energy sector is far worse than the supermarket sector in terms of its power and how much they're ripping us off. But they're a very visible example because we have to go there every week to buy the groceries. And that's why it's become politically potent. And I have argued, yes, we should go after the supermarkets for both of the directions that they exercise power, but use it as an opportunity to start a bigger conversation about corporate power and profits in Canada.
One down here.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much. Actually, I listened to your presentation a week ago, 2 weeks ago on...
Oh, so you had to laugh at my jokes twice.
Democratic socialism panel, so it was really good. So my question is about this. I mean, since especially in the 1980s, we have this finance capital dominating the whole global economy. And they have this obsession with keeping the inflation with 2% rate. We don't know why 2%, but it's an arbitrarily decided number, I suppose. But in this, the finance capital dominates. What we see also is that we have the excessive money as well, actually. We have excessive money generated somehow and circulating as welfare, emergency welfare. And we don't have spending, well-organized, well-defined social spending program, but we have emergency monies constantly pumped into the system. On the other hand, under this financial capitalism, pension plans are in jeopardy. Right? I mean, you give us a very dark picture, which is true, and I'm not sure, but I'm expecting that will happen. But I feel that actually our pension monies, which are circulating globally, will decline, will be in jeopardy. Yet our government also pushes the elderly aside. You know, the Ontario government wants them to put in the nursing homes, who knows what will happen. They will let them to die on their own. Maybe time to time they will send their nurses or something to look after them. So my question is, when our social security system is left to decision-making processes of finance capital, so what is and we don't have real investment in real economy, can we not think about investment in relation to social protection areas, like the care, health care, the families, the elder care, etc.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Your hand up, please, and high. There's one at the back here. Gary, there's one at the back. Yeah.
I'm wondering to what degree you think the greater long-term global picture is causing the effects you've outlined for us. For instance, it occurs to me, looking on the darker side of capitalism, of course, as you do, that orchestrated chaos to maintain world order, that's a theme that Bertrand Russell came up with, that chaos would be welcomed, even invited, to manufacture consent for global authoritarian rule. Two of the headlines in the news today are Guterres from the United Nations saying the world is on a road, a highway to climate help, and
Yeah, that's right. That was the rest of it.
well, there was it slipped my mind for a moment, but the idea being that in order to maintain any challenge to the Security Council's order, there will be an invitation to all kinds of intangible and uncontrollable mechanisms that you've described seem to be very, very difficult to get a handle on, that will help to disguise the kinds of manipulations that you're talking about. My question about arbitrage is related to the fact that some of the areas you talked about, like, is there a monopsony equivalent of the word arbitrage? For monopoly would be arbitrage, monopsony is that kind of collaboration you referred to. Is that the only kind of weapon that you would have in return to the kind of symphony of problems that are being permitted? It seems like Russia and the US are on the same page as far as rocking the lifeboats, so nobody can really understand that they're just maintaining the Security Council order.
Thank you. Thank you.
We need a global market shrink of 2/3, or this planet is done in 50 years.
Thank you so much, and my question will be for all three of you. As I'm an international student from Nepal, living here in Vancouver for 5 years, and we just got the news, like, it's a happy news for all the international students that we can work more, right? But as a representative of all the international students, my question will be, we have been helping for all the economic here. We've been working, and we are also helping the economic boom of this country. But with this news of working unlimited hours for international students, it will definitely hamper our education first. And then definitely we are in the Greekflation, so we want more money, and all the students will definitely work more hours. But then there will definitely be the problem with the healthcare. So even just to get into the healthcare, it's a nightmare when we get sick or when we have the mental health issue. So how are you going to tackle with this situation, since like all the students will work more hours and then they have to balance everything at once when they go through these mental traumas? Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't you take one more? There's a woman at the back. Carrie?
Hey, my question is, what can I as an individual do to help weather this recession that's coming and just generally act in the best interest of Vancouver, BC, Canada?
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you. Well, I don't know if I've got the best answer for that, or if our passionate, inspiring political leaders do. I mean, we often get asked, how, as an individual, can I protect myself? And the short answer to that is you can't, which is why we're here together. We have to find a collective solution. Obviously, everyone's going to, try and be as prudent-minded budgeting as they can if tough times are ahead. But what can you do as an individual, really, is to join a campaign, join your union, join a party, and fight for a policy that makes sense. And maybe I'll ask you two to supplement with an idea on that score.
Well, thank you very much for all those questions. But I have to say, Christy Freeland today just gave some advice. But in reality, I think what we need to look at, and certainly from my perspective, is that we need to actually pressure the government to recognize the reality. Some of the economic issues that's been brought up by Jim, the reality is that there is grieflation. How is it possible that at a time where things are getting so expensive, and you have the oil and gas sector, for example, just last year alone, making $147 billion. Just last year alone, over and above right? So you've got to ask the question, what is going on? So we talked about the cost of food and the supermarkets and how that's jacking up the price as well. This is over and above their normal profit margin. And that has to stop. That has to stop. And that's how, what we're trying to do in the House of Commons and raising these issues and putting that pressure on the government to do the right thing. Because there has to be that return to curb this and to bring it back to the people and focus on the people. I can go on for days. I won't. With that, I just want to touch on very quickly on the issue around international students. As the immigration critic, you're spot on. One of the things that we've been advancing and putting the pressure on the government is to recognize international students and their needs. The problem from my perspective is this: the government is not looking at what the needs are for the international students, but rather what's driven for them to open up the working hours to 20 hours is because the industry is saying to them that we need more workers. They're not doing this necessarily in the best interest of students, but rather is driven by a different force. If they were trying to do this in the best interest of students, what they would do is change the immigration policies, and then along with it, the high price of education for students. Those are the kinds of things that if you reverse trend and put the people first, you would come up with a different policy. And so that's why it's so important when we talk about these issues, when Jim raises the issue, when we talk about the economy, the inflation and so on, people always look at the Democrats as not the people with the solution. But we have to actually understand and not be afraid of the question around the economy and to take it on, because our solution is centered around the people. And when you do that, I think good things can happen.
Well done. Thank you. I'll take a quick response to a couple of the other questions. The one, a very interesting one about what I call the stock marketization of our social programs. The pension system, for example, as it gets more and more invested in this whole financial casino, then it sort of makes it seem like we're playing in the casino too. But of course we aren't. So the best way to deliver social programs is just raise the resources from society and allocate them. That's how we do the Canada Pension Plan. By and large, it has nothing to do with the stock market. That's how we do the Guaranteed Income Supplement and the Old Age Security Program. They're far safer. That's how we should do education funding. We shouldn't say you should go out and have an RESP to speculate on the stock market so that your kid can go to school. We should actually just fund universities properly so everyone can go to school. So you're absolutely right that this creeping power of the financial sector through our lives is a very insidious aspect of what we're dealing with, and maybe a financial crisis is going to be the spur for us to finally roll that back. And we have in some ways. The Canada Pension Plan has been expanded and is the safest plan going. Pierre Poilievre's still out there, tilting at windmills about the Canada Pension Plan being an unfair tax. What a bunch of nonsense. He would rather we all pay the money to Bay Street to, play games with it. Global chaos, I think we're going to get more than our share of global chaos in the next 2 years. I'm worried, and I'm not of the view that chaos naturally breeds something positive rising from the ashes. It can, but we have to be really building people's knowledge about what's happening and their hope and confidence that together we can build something better. I'm worried about the chaos that's coming, and that's why I'm really glad you all came tonight. So, thank you.
Please describe the loss of individual agency in a cashless society, and also the dangers of being digitally tethered to the equivalent of the global company store for dissidents and whistleblowers who risk being delegated to the algorithmic ghetto.
Wow, that was awesome. Thank you. I assume you're talking about Elon Musk there. Thank you.
I have one question for Jim and one for the MPs, if that's okay. The first question is, with the inflation and wages not keeping pace with the inflation, obviously there's got to be a rearrangement of how the average household divides their purchases. So obviously we're talking about energy, housing, food are getting a larger proportion of the pie of the household budget. I was wondering if you know where the cuts are happening. Is it digging directly into savings, or if there are other consumption sectors that are obviously shrinking then to the household? And for the MPs, we're talking about the profits and exactly how to redistribute them and how to do that fairly. I was just wondering concretely, what are the policies that you guys are working towards? Obviously, taxation is one for corporate profits or capital gains or anything like that. That would also help with the financialization. But, I mean, is there a way of maybe attacking that problem more at the root? A way of looking at how to disseminate market power throughout more firms so we don't have the ability of people like Loblaws to set that sustainable high prices. That's it.
I just want to ask, to whom should we write if we want to have some of these changes happen? I mean, we can write to you, our representatives, but you're already raising these issues. And I don't think we should leave it just up to the two of you and the NDP party and Parliament, but to whom can we write? Like, do we write to the Prime Minister? Do we write to Chrystia Freeland? Who do we appeal to make some of these regulations?
Two-part question for the two MPs. Housing supply and demand. So, demand. The government announced immigration quotas, 500,000 people a year, and I'm assuming that might be a minimum. How does that square with the fact that, number one, most of those people are going to be in Vancouver and Toronto, and that fact that those cities, including Vancouver, have very little supply? Number two, demand. I was lucky enough to experience the rental market here during the pandemic, and it was great. Landlords actually had to negotiate with you. They even give you either bonuses or like, oh, okay, we'll lower the rent, because they have nobody to rent to, no international students or immigrants. Now that we're back to normal, or more or less, in terms of supply at the federal level, what can the federal government and the NDP as quote-unquote the junior partner in government do to increase housing supply in our major cities? I was lucky enough to be in Europe for quite an extended time, and it was a surprise to me that nobody lives like us here, where in the middle of the city we would have single-family homes, where supposedly they're just occupied by one family, but as a young person, everybody knows those houses are occupied by multiple families. So is there anything at the federal level that you can do to reshape our cities so that people can actually live in them? For example, specifically, how would you deal with single-family homes? Would you eliminate them in our major cities? Are there any tools to do that? Thank you.
Let's just take one last question over here and then we'll answer. Gabriel down here to Larry, to Janet, Larry.
Hi. Australia has an unemployed workers union, which is just an advocacy group. Do you know if they've been effective and if there's been any effort to create such a group in Canada?
Okay, well, perhaps I'll go at the two or three that were for me and then pass to you guys. Yeah, okay, excellent. Okay, on the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, I know those folks, very dedicated. It is a kind of a social action group, kind of community-based, and they're out campaigning for better income support, basically employment insurance is how we would think of it, and more respect and better job creation opportunities. So very good little organization, and I think they do make a difference. We've had unions of unemployed workers in Canada before. We had a great big one in the 1930s. It made a great difference, and I guess we're probably going to need it again a couple of years from now, if my gloomy prognostication is correct. On the question of what happens when your real wage falls, what do you cut back on? That's a timely question, given Krista Freeland's brave announcement today that her family has canceled their Disney Plus subscription in order to save a little bit of money. And, you know, gosh, we can all find ways to cut back. So tone deaf, obviously. Now, of course, Poilievre is out there on the warpath about this. He lives in a freaking taxpayer-funded free mansion. He doesn't have to worry about the cost of his streaming services, so he's utterly hypocritical to make a deal out of this. You guys are the only ones with credibility in terms of saying, you know, we understand what life is like for actual working people. So the reality is they're cutting back on everything, including groceries. Here's an irony on the groceries front. The total amount we spend on groceries is going up because of the inflation. The actual amount in physical terms that we're buying is falling. So Canadians are buying less groceries. That's absolutely true. And there are people skipping meals and stuff like that because they absolutely can't make ends meet. So that's how severe this problem is and why we have to protect people, including with things like the expanded GST credit, which just started flowing today. And another tribute to the NDP caucus for leveraging that. The question on digital tethering, that was a fascinating question. I'd love to chat more and learn a bit about it, about your idea there. Certainly in the tech world, this problem of corporate power is probably its most extreme, as in any other sector. Because the reality is there's many things about networks and sort of conglomerations in the tech sphere that give the bigger player a huge advantage. And we see that just with Google. I mean, everybody uses Google because Google, not everybody, but most people use Google just because Google's got the biggest network. And then that becomes a self-reinforcing thing. Same happens with the other tech companies. Clearly it happens with Amazon. Amazon has this power, this market power that they built up, that again, they can extend forward and backward. They extend it forward to exploit consumers, they extend it backward to exploit suppliers. In the olden days, we had strong anti-competition laws. We'd actually go to companies like that and break them up because they were too big. You know, in some cases that could still be the solution. Or it could be a question of very tight regulation, very high taxes on their super profits, or helping build alternatives. Some of those things, like Google, are really just a meeting place. You know, the kind of thing in a more sophisticated technology that we used to do in the town square. And why should it be owned, and now, as Elon Musk is showing us, controlled and censored because some billionaire happens to own it? So that will have to be part of our progressive strategy as well. Thank you for that question.
Thanks to some of the specific policies that you requested from the NDP. I'm going to come at that in two ways. One is, I think, I'll go general to specific. Generally, I think we're in a real struggle for narrative right now. That's how I think it's a dangerous time right now because, as Jim pointed out, the right has, what's the old phrase? They have answers that are fast, simple, cheap, and wrong. And I think we right now, there's a real risk that working people can be in a funny way seduced by these simple things and actually come to believe that the medicine that's needed for the economy is Buckley's, you know, and that they're going to have to swallow a lot of this. So, you know, the thing about this is that not all Canadians are harmed or affected equally by austerity or by the current economic policies. Some actually benefit from it. The vast majority of working people do not. And so I think the struggle for narrative is one of austerity versus investing in our economy. And you know, the other thing that Pierre Poilievre doesn't do is he doesn't pay to have his teeth fixed. You do. You pay for he and his children to have his teeth fixed. So he believes in dental care for his family, but not for your family. And so those are some of the things I think we have to worry about on a narrative level to burst that bubble and make it clear to working people that Pierre Poilievre and conservative policies are not policies that are designed for working people. Specifically, you talked about higher corporate taxes. You know, Jim would know more about this than we do, but Canada, we've been on this declining corporate income tax downward spiral for decades. I think right now we're at 15% for corporate income tax. I wish I paid 15%. You probably wish you paid 15%. That's what corporations do. But we've called for an excess profits tax, which was just shot down, by the way, by Finance Minister Freeland the other day. specifically excess profit tax on the oil and gas sector. She said no. And my understanding is that the oil and gas sector had the most profitable year in history this last year. So if you don't have an excess profits tax now, I guess you don't ever have one. We've also called for aggressively pursuing offshore tax havens. There was a Department of Finance, I think, revealed that there was some $30 billion of unpaid taxes, not income, taxes owed, that is sheltered in offshore tax havens just in 2020 alone. So we say, let's pull that money back for a good portion of it. Jim commented on this a bit, stronger anti-cartel laws and better enforcement of the Competition Act. You might remember this, I think it was from 2015, this allegation of price fixing in bread. Now, you know what, if you stole a loaf of bread tonight, you'd probably be charged, convicted, sentenced, and serve your time within, a year. That allegation from 2015 is still being investigated 7 years later. I don't know what happens when the price of bread is the same at all of these supposed competitors. I mean, it shouldn't take that long to figure out that there's price fixing going on. But I think we need a renaissance in Competition Act and in breaking up monopolies. I think FDR did this after the Depression. I think this was a major piece of dealing with, can't remember who said that capitalism leads inexorably to monopoly capitalism, but it started with an M and ended with an X. And but it's quite clearly, I think, the case now, and I think we have to start breaking up those monopolies. And finally, I'll just say things like, I put a little slip on the table that we printed out for Labor Day this year. Jim spent many years in the labor movement, as did I, and I think it was said that there's been no force in Western economies that have done more to help lift people out of poverty than the trade union movement. And so labor laws they're not just like an interesting attribute of government. They are a fundamental force for economic distribution of power. And we saw that in Ontario. And it's really delightful to see labor flex and stare down a brazen attempt to violate what is a constitutional right. The Supreme Court of Canada said the right to collectively bargain, the right to strike, is a constitutionally protected right. And so I think things like one thing the NDP did in our confidence and supply agreement was to force the Liberals to put a ban on scab labor in this country at the federal level. This has been something trade unions have been fighting for decades over. It's kind of symbolic, but if any of you remember the giant mine strike in Yellowknife, people died. People have died on picket lines. So things like, let's take a look at our labor and employment laws and strengthen that so that working people and trade unions and progressive forces in society can actually play a larger role in the economy and help address that imbalance, I think, is also important. And finally, I just want to say full employment. I think we didn't talk about it much tonight, but I like a policy that pursues full employment. There should be a job in this country for every single person who wants to contribute their talents and skills in whatever way they're able to do that. And I don't think full employment has been part of our economic policy. I wouldn't mind hearing Jim comment his views on that as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Jenny for her thoughts on the housing, because she's our housing critic.
Thanks very much, Don, and thank you for those questions. I just want to touch very briefly on the issue around excessive profiteering. I mean, it's really quite something that when you have the UN Secretary really issuing a statement and calling for the leadership of governments to actually put in a windfall tax. And some countries actually have done it, but not Canada, right? I mean, that's really something, and I think we should always keep that in mind. This phenomenon, what's going on right now, is not just for Canada, it's happening globally as well. And there are ways in terms of a path forward. So I'm just going to pause there. So now I'm going to get into housing. It's like you have to yank the mic away from me because I can't stop talking about housing. But I'll tell you, on the issue around housing, where it ties into the economy is this, in my view. The Canadian government has allowed for housing to be treated as a stock market. That's the problem. with housing, and then as acknowledged, the cost of housing is a significant component of the pressure for everybody. The vast majority of Canadians are paying more than 30% of their total income towards housing. In fact, that number is now increasing more and more so. And so what do I mean when I say stop the financialization of housing? Stop allowing for it to be treated as a stock market. It is not a commodity. Housing should be treated as housing, as a basic human right. And the Canadian government needs to treat housing with that perspective and formulate its policy from that perspective. And so what do we do with the current situation right now? Well, we can put a moratorium on on REITs, on the real estate investment trusts, as an example, which incidentally, they also get very special tax treatment. They don't actually have to pay the corporation tax level, but even though they operate like a corporation, right? And so as long as that return of that profit goes back to all the investors, they don't have to pay corporation taxes. That special treatment has to end. We need to stop allowing for this to continue on. When the Liberal government back in 1993 canceled the National Affordable Housing Program, Canada lost more than 500,000 units of affordable housing and co-op housing that would otherwise have been built. Imagine what that would look like. I mean, that number has increased now because this number was generated back in 2015 when I ran for office. So 7 years later, we know that that number has increased significantly because during that period, we also lost housing as well, lost affordable housing rental stock, to whom, when the federal government decided that they would not renew the mortgages for social housing and co-op housing, we lost a significant stock with respect to that. And then when the financialization of housing came into play, these investors came in and purchased up the low end of the market housing and reno evicted people, we lost significant amount of stock as well. So we have to stop this from happening. Otherwise, we will never be able to build enough housing to make up for what we're losing as it stands right now. And so that equalizer has to be in place, and you've got to go at it from both ends. On the question, and I won't go on more about that, I could, but I won't. On the question around the immigration levels as it tied to the need around housing, I first have to say this. You know, we have to be very careful on how we look at this issue and not scapegoat the people who are coming to Canada, right? And the truth of the matter is, with our immigration levels is this: we already have over 500,000 people who are here in Canada without status or have temporary status, or some who's lost their status as a result tied to COVID, actually, because over the COVID period, their work permits, their study permit had expired, and because of COVID, because of lockdown and so on and so forth, they can't get those things renewed, and then they're stuck. Right? We already have 500,000 people that are already here. We should be regularizing them. Instead of looking right now to bring in more temporary foreign workers to address the labor skill shortage, right? There are people who can do that work right now, and we should be giving them status to do that work, and that means we need to regularize them. And then we can look at other immigration policies and see what it looks like. And then tying that to housing, the question around housing, you'll hear Poilievre saying this, you hear the Liberals saying this as well. They're only just talking about housing in the context of building more supply. But it is not just any supply. It is the affordable supply is the real question that we need to fill the market with. So we can start with, and which is why the NDP is saying that we need to build at least 500,000 units of affordable housing, of co-op housing, to fill that market, to fill the need to begin with, and then to really drive that. And as we know, that is very much tied to our economy and very much tied to job creation as well. In any event, I won't go on because I could, but I must stop. So. All right, I think I've just been instructed by my good colleague here that we're coming to the end. It's 10 to 9, and so we should probably do a quick wrap up, and then I'll also invite Jim, of course, to see if they have any last words to say in this wrap up. Maybe I can let you go first, Jim, and then I will sort of take it from there.
Well, look, thank you both very much for hosting this meeting and pulling everyone together at a moment that's concerning, but where we'll be much stronger if we enter it together and with the knowledge of why it's happening and what we can do about it. So I'm grateful to you for hosting it and grateful to all of you for coming tonight and committing to fight for some justice and safety as we go through this difficult time. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I have to say, not only was your presentation informative, it was entertaining. You inject humor into this. You made it into a commonplace for us to talk about the economy, what the solutions can be, and what the challenges are, and how we can bring it forward. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time, and for you to continue to be that voice, to be the progressive economists out there, to say that there is a better way, and to demand also this conversation from all of us. So I want to say a big thank you to you. The big takeaway, what did I get coming out of this today? Really, inflation is tied to big corporations profiteering. It is as simple as that. And the prime example, we've already talked about some of those. It is about the high energy costs. It is about housing. It's about food security, the high cost of the grocery stores, and so on. And so until we are ready and willing for governments to face up to that, we're not really going to address the problem in a real way. And then they're looking for scapegoats. And what are they doing with the Bank of Canada? They're independent, I get that, but they are redirecting the issues to the people to say it's your fault, that you're making too much money, when in fact, we're not, and people are not making more money. And that has already been established by facts and figures, right? Facts and figures, they say, well, people are objective, or subjective, they have their own opinions and so on. But when you have the data to back it up, you can actually look at it. The people's wages are not increasing at the rate of inflation. People are not making oodles of money. Who are the people who's making oodles of money? Well, they're the big corporations, the big CEOs. We should be focusing on them and trying to get that as the equalizer. And so, so we've got our work cut out for us. Those are the things that we are demanding in the House of Commons, and we'll continue to do so. We talked about price fixing, for example. There are absolutely concerns with respect to that, and it's been highlighted that there's a history of that as well. And so the NDP did in fact move a motion in the House on this, and is triggering some reaction. So at least it's being looked into at this point in time, and more work needs to be done. On the impact of inflation, you all know it. You experience it every day. And so we have to work hard to raise these issues. Somebody asked the question, what can you do, right, as individuals? Contacting your member of parliament, of course, you're already doing so, that's why you're here today. But I would also say, take it up to social media, right? The government actually watches and spends a lot of time and see what's going on with respect to that. And so take your message to the social media, phone into your radio stations, write your op-eds, get your friends and neighbors to contact their member of parliament and to demand that action. The more we talk about it, the more we not let the other narrative win the day. That means we have a chance of overturning it. And we must work towards that and never give up that space. Breathe their space and be in their space. Go to your chambers of commerce, talk to your local small business community, and band together, right? And then so that you now have this knowledge and the ability, of course, and your interest in move this forward. So let's take it forward and drive that agenda and find common ground with political movements. And finally, I'll close with this. I always say what we need to do is cross-pollinate. And I mean it, like not just stick with our issue, on our same track, but use the principle of the issues and apply it to different tracks. So whether it be on the issue around housing or price gouging, oil and gas, the environment, wages, union rights, workers' rights. Support all of those movements. And when we do that, you will gain that momentum, you will build that voice, and make that noise be heard, right? Make that loud noise and demand that action. And that's where I think you can see change. And that's where I believe in democracy, where it really works, it is the voice of the people. Your voice matter, and make it be heard, and demand for it to be heard, and cross-pollinate on the issues to bring it home. So with that, my friends, I want to say thank you to all of you for taking time to be here today. It really just warms my heart. I'm all rearing to go back to the House of Commons and to fight this fight and bring your questions, to bring your perspective, and to bring your demands to the House of Commons to affect change. Thank you so much.